Now for card number 11, or sometimes 8, depending on tarot decks. They sometimes switch strength and justice. I spoke about that in the strength video, number 8, and the main difference being that those that base themselves off the quite old French Marseille deck will more often than not have the card number 8 as justice, whereas those that maybe potentially draw from the Rider-Waite tradition will have it as 11. Now it is quite interesting. I'm not exactly sure why it shifted over time. Definitely something I will look into more at some point. But for today, to do justice to 4 with justice, if I felt like I didn't quite do justice to the Wheel of Fortune, card number 10. So firstly, to start with, common symbolism you will see will be scales, and not surprisingly, justice is associated with the zodiac sign of Libra. Again, the symbols of the scales. So fairly self-explanatory term, but as a concept, what is meant by justice? What aspects of justice are there? What's one's relationship to that concept? Yeah. So I guess predominantly you'll see symbolism, which is very much about balance. More often than not, a card will portray some symmetry or harmony within it. You can see in the Cosmic Tarot, this one, yin yang, very much about balancing positive and negative, neutrality, equanimity, and stability, I think, is another thing of component within justice. For something to be just, it has to be based on something stable, something of merit. If it is not, then it will naturally recompense if it's out of balance. That'll be a process that will happen over time. So yeah, quite often you'll also see other symbolism of a sword as well, or other times it will be a tool of some sort. One hand will have a tool, oftentimes a weapon, and this is, in other books it's shown as a scroll, or other tarots I should say, a scroll or a book, basically signifying both the learning of law, or what is a law within a realm, but also the ability to dish out justice, so the tool of the implement. You'll see very tucked away in the corner here is a woman holding a gun. So there is justice that is very forceful at times, and whether that comes from an external source or whether that comes from an internal source, it's a component. Whether it feels legitimately valid or not, we all have experiences of this. Another aspect quite often portrayed will be something around symbolism around the head, whether it be here, you've got these kind of almost like fingers, or they do look like fingers, but they're also light streaming from windows and portals, and then being channeled down and through one's eyes. Over here, you have this wonderful, wonderful kind of window portal of eyes, which is another beautiful symbolism for and concept associated with justice. Now, the kind of highlighting of the mental realm is to kind of say, take one's time with thinking, with musing, with understanding from a rational perspective what is just, what is correct course of action or application to a situation. So it's a slight call away from emotiveness, because in extreme emotiveness all sorts of things unfold, and especially, let's say, when one has maybe been hurt or slighted or suffered, and one then calls for justice or has that shift, there needs to be a recompense or something need to be acknowledged. If it's from a very emotive place, that can overcloud the clearer channel of rationalism within a situation. It becomes blind as such, or one can become blind with rage, etc. So definitely concepts of that there, portrayed in, I think, majority of these cards. You'll see some form of symbolism, and beautifully expressed in the first card, which is from the Valentina Tarot, is the scales are above. So it's looking objectively about what is balanced, what is fair. That isn't to say that the only way of understanding justice is through the mind. And in these first two cards here, the second one here being from the Cosmic Tarot, there's kind of these allusions to the justice or component of the heart's knowing. In the Cosmic Tarot, there's the rose at the bottom, oftentimes a symbol for love or the heart's passions. And also, I think, very subtly but lovely expressed in the first card here, the clock workings, the machinery, the cogs, the balancing process is happening within this figure's chest cavity, within their internal spaces and in the center of their being, in their heart. So that is where the balancings sort of are quite important. And interestingly expressed, you'll notice at the top the scales are out of balance. So how is one to bring balance? And this figure is even pointing to it. Within the situation, it's to go inside and ask oneself, what is the path? And you'll see the weapon is held low, because there is the potential for retribution and justice, which isn't necessarily restorative at all. One thing I really like expressed in this first card here is that the figure has their back to the viewer, which, when thought about, is a kind of a vulnerable position. And I think that kind of reiterates that going inside oneself, one's own sort of heart spaces, to figure out what is noble, what is just, what is right, whether it be for self or for others or the wider world, is a potential aspect that could be seen as vulnerable. But there's strength in vulnerability. We've kind of explored that in the strength card. It's easy enough to hide behind or utilize a book with written word going, no, it says this. And I mean, what's at stake there? Is that your true feeling, or is that just a piece of paper and some words that give a version of legitimacy to a situation? So I really, really like that particular portrayal of justice there, and I will introduce a couple of other very nice cards here now. Hopefully they'll just sit nicely there. Kind of. There we go. Oh, I don't want that. How are we doing? That'll do nice. So firstly, I haven't had one from this deck for a while. This is the Shadowscapes Tarot. The first one here. Something wonderful within this is, as I've said oftentimes, a hand will be holding scales on one side and something else on the other side. And in this one, the figure is holding a feather. Now, to me, this instantly brings to mind in the Egyptians' version of, or in Egyptian mythology, version of the afterlife, and part of the journey happens where before it's decided where you go, your heart is weighed against a feather. And to me, that is personally one of the most beautiful components to think about or to muse on, or it's one that deeply resonates with me. It implies that one's heart need not hold grudges, need not be heavy unnecessarily. A lightness implies, both the radiance of light as from the sun or illumination, but also a lightness of density, of matter that isn't stagnant, holding, vibrating low, that is of lightness and nearness, a peace even. Because without peace, there is, how does one feel when one is not at peace with things? There's an injustice. Oh, I'm wrong. There's a war. It's down there. It's down there energy. It's not a light heart. So I do really, really, really love that particular portrayal of it, and yeah, and there's a subtlety in it. Like there's a musing on the feather, but also the feet position are not so much fixed and stable. You'll see in other cards, and the one on the left, it's a very, very straight up and down, like the exactitude. There's a preciseness. Whereas this, there's a bit of give, there's a bit of balancing involved. Which is a part. There's the concept that not enough movement within justice, being inflexible, is a disservice. And I'll talk about this briefly in the card here we have from the Thoth deck, Justice, but it's been renamed Adjustment, which I really like. It's implying, it's saying explicitly that we've got to balance, we've got to move. Nothing should be overly fixed for too long. It's good to have a center point, but from that center point, everything moves. And if you think about scales, you need that center point, but you don't necessarily. It's kind of pivotal for how things function, but it's not. It's not on either side. It's kind of like, how would I explain it? It's like a central knowing that doesn't go into the judging. right? It goes into it's behind that. It's yeah, it's an important component, but it's not the obvious one. Whereas the obvious one is about movement and allowance of movement, of weighing one thing against the other. So the important things are to remind oneself not to be too fixed within concepts, as it may be, but have an ability to look, to discern, to decide. So another aspect expressed through, in correlations through justice, is choices. Whether we frame them in a moralistic sense or just in a pure kind of what is right for us, what is best, what is most desirable. And it's sort of, it is quite implied and expressed within this adjustment card from the Thoth deck with the baubles. The baubles, or balls around here, are like kind of representative of Maya, or the world of illusion, which can be seen as anything here: a dynamic, a drama, a play, whatever is a thing in and of itself, that is quantifiable in some way or packageable. And so there's sort of the concept of, well, amongst all of these things, it's like, what actually has personal importance and significance? So a concept of justice is that ability to kind of recognize these things for what they are, and then be able to ascribe one's own merit of what is worthy of my time and attention. What do I need to get involved in weighing up or feeling is my part to play in this dynamic, and what is best to leave alone and let float by as not my monkeys, not my kind of circus. Because as much as it is beautiful and wonderful and lovely to care for others and express that and show that, sometimes the act of I care is as much just a display for others to see, or self to see and believe in. And if it comes, it's an interesting version, and I'm talking about this in the sense of like standing up for injustices, etc. I'm not saying this is a bad thing or a wrong thing at all. It's totally valid and perfectly fine, and something I believe in myself at times. But at the same time, if it's there's the thought process around, is it a distraction from my own stuff I need to get into balance? Is it a distraction from maybe even recognizing where one can have the most value and positive effect and influence in the personal sphere? I'll leave that sort of little tangent at that. Really nicely portrayed is, rather than being held the scales in this particular card, is the figure is the scales. It's kind of, they flow into each other. And again, you've got some opposites there, the alpha and the omega at the beginning and the end, and where one finds oneself in between that situation. Another little slight tangent I did want to mention and muse on is this cap, or the figure of a kind of cap, or even in this next card here, which just move this lovely one to the side. This one here, and that one is from the, what's it called, Night Sun Tarot. Interesting, because justice and liberty. I mean, how does one have liberty in a society without some form of protection of liberty? And hence why there's justice, and why Libra is associated, and why you can even go down and look into Liberty, the statue of. I mean, interestingly enough, the spikes, the crown is quite reminiscent in this. And this ties back to ancienter kind of cults of Rome or of Italy, probably Italy even pre-Roman Empire times, but early Roman society of Liber and Libertas, so like different fertility goddess and god of the proletariat, or the plebeians, the basically common man. And these were fertility goddesses and gods, and celebrations of grain and wine. So they sort of got morphed into other figures down the line, Bacchus and Dionysus and that sort of Greek tradition. But before that, they were part of worship of the masses, of not just what is right, but what is important, what is essential, what gives one value in one's life. And that's a component of what justice should be, or ideals of justice are essentially about being able to provide liberty, the pursuit of one's enjoyment of life, at not the compromise of others to do the same. That's in an idealized world. I mean, idealism is a really interesting thing. On one hand, I do really, really love it and think there's a beauty to strive towards some form of idealism, but on the other hand, to have a balanced approach to it, there is over idealism can leave one reluctant or even unable to deal with things in a less than ideal world. So it's not to say one shouldn't have one and not the other. It's recognizing the values of both, of not being over too attached to idealism as a hindrance to dealing with what is, but also not throwing it out, meaning one still strives towards the better. Yeah. Well, and I was also going to mention in the tradition of the hat as well, which you may see kind of alluded to here. At times a crown, a ritual of an ancient cap. Now I forget the name of it now. Which in the early days of Rome, and this is Libertas, part of the rituals there and worship, was around the freeing of slaves. And they wore a specific hat after the heads was shaven, meaning they were freed from slavery. So it is really interesting, that concept of what freedom is, or what liberty is, because justice is definitely wrapped up in these components. So it's sort of saying that it is really interesting, that cap. So you're freed from being a slave, but then in that sort of tradition of early Rome, it's like, well, before that you didn't have any rights, but with rights come responsibilities. So you are freed in a way from absolute servitude with very little rights to, oh, I've got some rights, but now I have some responsibilities of how then I interact with the world around me and society, and exercising of these rights. And that can be seen however one wishes. Yeah, and I'll now move back just quickly to this beautiful card on the left, which I skipped over, which is from the Hush Tarot. Now I was talking about idealism before, and I really like this representation of justice, which has a spear / axe on the armored side, and then an arrow in the other hand. So no scales present, and the animal symbolism of we have bees and we have ants. So we have some kind of bitey creatures in the ants and some stingy creatures in the bees. Um, so in the non-idealized world, there is the slights and stings and bites that just being and just operating can have against us. So again, it's very interesting that this figure is portrayed naked, like again implying the sense of vulnerability. Like to live is to be vulnerable, to live is to die, to live is to suffer the wounds of life. But the figure does not look dejected. They look relatively composed, slightly contemplative, but quite direct, knowing that this is part of the process of life, and it can build one's resilience. That within justice as a concept of the internal is to cleave one's way through a particular world, is to suffer the slights of others, but do so in a humble and a noble and a peaceful way, because peace is also another component of justice, and kind of yeah, to find peace within one's allotment and path, without needing to overly rely on external justifications, but to be in harmony, which is another aspect of this particular card as well. Yeah, and a couple more. It's going to be a long video. A couple more, I say. So I realised I've got 3 cards. I really quite like this one, and thought I'd throw it in. This is from what is it called? Everyday Witch Tarot. Yeah, it's it's nice. It's a really playful tarot deck. Quite striking imagery, clean, sharp, good colors, and lots of cats around it. Again, you've got explorations of duality, black and white, and balancing there, and then you've got this figure with the book, the law, which I'm wondering, is this a slight Thoth reference, maybe, perhaps, or Aleister Crowley's famous work, the book, the law. Yeah, but the reason why I wanted to throw this one in is the binding over the eyes can quite often be seen in various representations of justice, and I won't list them all because there's so many. The the little sayings we have around justice to do with seeing and sight. An eye for an eye makes the world go blind. Justice is blind. There's quite a lot. There was even another one today, and there's plenty more, but I won't go too much into detail about it. But I kind of like it in the sense of that, there's things known without obviousness, and I think that's a part of justice. What is right in one's heart? What is known to be good action? What is known to be karmically of value? I think these things are intrinsically and inherently known towards us. It's not to say that we always follow them, or that people don't operate in all sorts of ways. But I do believe there is this knowing of what is good and just and right, and it's potentially, I am of the believer that it's on each individual to discern and discover that for themselves in a very internal process, rather than having it as an enforced external thou shalt, thou must, because I believe in this thing called free will, strangely enough. I think it's a wonderful gift that we have been given So, lastly, to wrap up this justified justice video, two particular representations of justice from the Shakespeare tarot key, which is exquisite, and I really like this portrayal. We've got a shackled monkey, and this figure with a sword and a cross and scales and some ritually around them, standing on a coin. Now, I really like this as kind of a I'll call it a concept piece. And you've got this beautiful, looks like Venice in the background. So beautiful architecture. So we're alluding to mercantilism and merchant class, a class of wealth. And I feel like this kind of poses a question around, are our systems of justice, have they developed in a way that basically protects the have classes, the wealthy classes, those that are already privileged or have gone about their ways of acquiring in perhaps less than noble or ideal ways? And I think that's a very fair argument to make, and a critique of a system of justice, if that's what it's doing at the expense of an equal measure of justice to all, then that's an issue. And I think it's almost like the shackled kind of monkey, or collared, or maybe it's a tightrope. Anyway, that little line between the two. But it's almost like, is that stifling our evolution as a kind of species? Are we kind of stuck? And many might argue that the capitalist fucking system is hugely to the massive detriment of millions, billions of beings that are that it's an entrapment. So that's a that's a wonderful perspective on it. And on the other hand, because in this particular deck we get two versions of justice. In this one we have a much more kind of religiously explicit version of what justice may be seen, but you'll notice that the scales are very heavily tilted. So we have a portrayal of Star of David, Sigil of Solomon within a circle, and then on the other side we have these figures down here weighing, and then weighing, and then weighing, and then weighing, like a fractal. We weigh. But it's always skewed. It's repeating the same pattern. So it's kind of an allusion to, if the original model is off balance or unjust, those cycles will perpetuate and repeat. And it says at the bottom, the devil can cite scripture for the people. So again, it's like, is the original model slightly skewed or off? Is it perpetuating